Thank you very much, Mihai, and thank you, Maureen. And I'm glad to be here. I hope you can hear me okay. Just interrupt if the hearing is bad. So I've got quite a lot of slides. I may move fairly quickly because I don't want to bore you too much. But I'm going to talk from the point of view of agroforestry policy mainly. With a little bit about environmental impact, because I think a number of things are changing quite dramatically, particularly in terms of carbon sequestration and in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, that I think will make agroforestry important in Romania and in most other European countries, more important than it seems to be in many agricultural departments throughout Europe at the moment. So let's get started. You see in this slide, you see Iberian pigs grazing underneath evergreen oak. And this is in the east of Spain and also in the south of Portugal. It's a very common sight. So there are about 8 million hectares of this type of mixed agroforestry system in Europe. So if anyone plans to take a holiday, I thoroughly recommend going to Portugal or to the east of Spain for this. So the next slide, I'm going to be talking about the types of agroforestry, the data we have about trees outside the forest, the European Green Deal, which I'm sure everybody knows about, how we can measure the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy targets, biodiversity targets, climate targets, and then other indicators of environmental impact and biodiversity. So they're just a plug for the European Agroforestry Federation. You can see our new website at the bottom, and everyone's very welcome to go to that. So types of agroforestry, there are many, many definitions, and the first message is don't worry, keep calm, it doesn't matter. There have been big arguments about what the definition should be, but as I'll show later, it's actually quite difficult to put an upper limit on the number of trees and a lower limit on the number of trees. So we're tending to suggest that any trees on agricultural land should be considered as agroforestry. So I'll leave those definitions there for a while. There are some words like woody perennials, which are difficult for a farmer to understand and not very useful in a definition. There are other definitions like the second one, which sound very nice, but actually are impossible to measure. These are nice things that agroforestry does, but how do you quantify that? And then there's the US Department of Agriculture definition, including the growing of trees and shrubs. So there's some discussions about whether shrubs should be included, shrubs on their own. And you see, well, we'll see in a minute, that may cause problems. But this is the simple definition used in the last rural development regulation. So they're land use systems in which trees can be grown in combination with agriculture on the same land. And actually that definition does include the use of animals within forest land as well. So it can be either agricultural land with trees or forest land with animals. So that definition is quite flexible. But it does raise some difficulties. For example, this is Calluna vulgaris, a dwarf shrub which covers huge areas in Scotland but never grows above that sort of height. Should that be included as agroforestry? It's not a tree. So I would say if it doesn't get to the height of a tree, it's not really agroforestry. The same with these dwarf birch in Lapland in the north of Sweden. Maybe that is agroforestry, maybe not. One tree in an agricultural field, I don't know whether that's agroforestry or not. Similarly, this is saltbrush in Spain. It doesn't get very high. So the point is that it's for the member states of the European Union themselves to make their own definition. And if you click on this presentation, you'll find each country has their own definition. So I should, Constantine, I'm sorry, I should have included the Romanian definition. Forgive me for doing that. Maybe we can look at that in the discussion at the end. So remind me, it might be worth doing that. So next slide. But the classification that we have within Europe makes a distinction between forest land and agricultural land. And we can see, for example, that a silvopastoral system on forest land could be called forest grazing, whereas on agricultural land it could be called wood pasture. Okay, and we have translated all of these definitions. Again, Constantine, I should have shown the Romanian version of this. Again, we can have a look at that at the end. So there's not a good definition of agroforestry in each country, but there is a good definition of forest land. So in Romania, for example, the minimum area, the minimum block for an area of forest is 1/4 of a hectare. It's 0.25 hectares. So anything smaller than that is not forestry. Therefore, it's probably agroforestry if it's on agricultural land. Similarly, in Romania, the width of a forest block is 20 meters. If it's 15 meters, it's not forestry, it's agroforestry. So these are useful definitions, and we have these definitions for every single country in Europe. So it will be quite interesting to compare the forestry law and see whether at all times these thresholds are used in Romania. So that's the definition of forest. The member states have been very bad actually at measuring the number of trees and the crown area of trees outside the forest. So you can see all the member states in Europe here. And you can see the forest land, they're very good at measuring forest land. There's this other thing called other wooded land, which is land which has not sufficient percentage of tree cover to be called a forest. And then there's another thing which is called other land with tree cover. So if we look, for example, at Greece, we've got almost 50% of the area of trees is outside forest. Whereas if we look at Poland, they say they have no trees, 0 trees outside the forest, which is very unlikely, but that's what they say in the statistics. Romania has none of this other land with tree cover, which I'm surprised about, and a fairly small amount of other wooded land. So only 0.2% of the trees in Romania are outside the forest. So I think we can agree that there's something strange about these statistics, because there are many trees on agricultural land which are not included in these statistics sent to the FAO. So the first thing is to have a look at how we can improve that. And there are many, many ways now with satellites to measure trees and to count trees outside of forests. And if they can do it in the Sahara, we can surely do it in Europe. So this is using a method to calculate 1.8 billion individual trees in this area of the Sahara using satellite photographs. So that's a question of how we measure the trees. If we are talking about new planting, where should that new planting be? This map is one which we produced 2 years ago as an input to the European Forestry Strategy, because the Forestry Strategy and the European Biodiversity Strategy have a commitment to planting 3 billion additional trees in Europe. And the Department for the Environment in Europe asked us where we thought these additional 3 billion trees should go. And this is a map showing agricultural land, only agricultural land in Europe. And superimposed on that is a product from the Copernicus system, which shows the percentage tree crown cover. So if you look at the red marks, that shows agricultural land which has 0, absolutely absolute zero over a 1 hectare area, no trees at all. And then 1.5 and 6 to 10. So our argument was that those areas which have greatest landscape need of trees, they suffer greatest erosion from wind erosion, from water erosion, where trees should be planted are the tree deserts. And that's where we should be focusing the tree planting. And what we want to do is use this map as a long-term target for Europe. So we can say to Europe, okay, each year or each 2 years, when you produce this map again, how much red is decreasing and how much green is taking over? How many trees are we planting outside the forest throughout Europe, with a target of reaching 10% tree cover throughout Europe by 2030, which is the next big climate change target date. Okay, so that's where we should be planting trees. Let's look at the Green Deal, which we all know about. So the Green Deal has many different components: farm to fork, circular economy, emissions trading scheme, forest strategy, adaptation to climate change. All of those are important. The one which is happening just as we speak is that each country, including Romania, is producing its own national climate and energy NECP policy. Yeah, policy statements. Now this, I would be very interested in the discussion whether anyone knows whether there has been a discussion in Romania about these policies, because the important thing is that the policy has to show how Romania will meet the new targets that it has been given for greenhouse gas sequestration. And there should have been a big public debate about that, and everything should be ideally published in June, but I don't know whether anybody here has heard anything about that. It would be very interesting. So that's one Green Deal target. The next slide relates to, again, the greenhouse gas emissions reporting systems that all countries do. And all countries have 6 categories of land. They have cropland, they have grassland, they have wetland, they have forest land, and they have settlements. And they are supposed that most of them focus a lot on calculating the effect of trees on greenhouse gas sequestration on forest land, but many of them don't do anything at all for cropland or for pasture land. They ignore the trees in these areas at a national level. So the other thing that we're trying to do is campaign for better measurement and monitoring of those statistics. And also each country, the Commission is trying to encourage each country to use better and better models for calculating greenhouse gas emissions and better identification of land parcels so that we know whether it's cropland or grassland or forest. And again, Romania and all countries are being urged to move towards this tier 3 approach 3 with full geo-tracking of parcels. Also, what is happening, and it's quite exciting, is that countries are being asked not just to measure this thing called LULUCF, which is land use change and forestry, but they're also asked to integrate that with the measurements of nitrous oxide and methane emissions from agricultural land. So from 2025 onwards, we will have integrated reporting across the whole of the land use pillar. So integrating agriculture, forestry, and agroforestry in between, which is one thing that EURAF has been arguing for a long, long time. Okay, so moving on for a minute from climate to look at CAP monitoring. Everybody will know that there are area payments made to farmers under something called Pillar 1, but a farmer does not get those area payments free for nothing. The farmer must maintain his or her land in good agricultural and environmental condition. And this, in the new CAP, there are things called eco schemes, which are short-term schemes, low financing, but farmers must do that to get a portion of their money released, and those are environmental focus schemes. Together with that, there are rural development programs in what's called Pillar 2. And Pillar 2 can fund forestry. So the forestry schemes in Romania will be funded through Pillar 2 there. So we would like to see forest grazing being supported in Pillar 2. But the important thing is at the top right now in the current CAP, Article 4 of the new CAP clearly says that agricultural area shall include agroforestry systems. So there's no doubt, there should be no doubt in anybody's mind that agroforestry is eligible for basic payments. There has been doubt in past years. So I talked about the elements of conditionality, the thing that every farmer has to do. There are now 9 of these. But agroforestry contributes to all of those, like maintaining permanent grassland or protecting wetlands or improving the filtration of nitrate, managing tillage. All of those we think that agroforestry can make a contribution to. The 10 good agricultural and environmental conditions. And one of those agricultural environmental conditions is the new Gaia Gate, which is very important for trees outside the forest because it includes hedgerows or lines of trees. It includes trees in groups and isolated trees, and also forest edges. So there are a number of other landscape features like buffer strips, piles of stones, ponds and terraces, but these are the main ones that EURAF is interested in. And I think the next slide, the next slide is here. It's quite detailed, so you can stop the presentation and look at it in detail later. But I was talking about the woody forest strips, which are these ones, hedges or woody strips, trees in line, trees in groups, as long as they're not a forest, so they're less than the threshold size. So in Romania, if we look at that one, Romania over here, so we see, interesting, you've got a problem here. So the minimum threshold size is 1/4 of a hectare. But according to the strategic plan, it can be agriculture if it's as big as 0.9 of a hectare. So that tends to suggest that the forestry department has not been talking to the agricultural department when the Romanian strategic plan was written. So that may be something you want to check at a local and national level, but you're not unusual in that. The same has happened in all the countries that have got red numbers there. There's a difference between the minimum threshold of forest and the maximum threshold of a small area of woodland that is still agriculture. But anyway, if we look at Romania, we'll see Romania on the next slide, but you see a lot of countries now are implementing hedges, woody strips, trees in line, trees in groups as landscape features, which count towards the 10% of agricultural land that should be maintained in high biodiversity landscape features, and also count towards the requirement for Gaia Gate, which is slightly different. So these are Romanian figures taken from your strategic plan. If you click on the link, you'll get you've got a link to the plan in Romanian. So you see that that hedgerows, trees in line, and these are the conversion factors. So if you have an individual tree, for example, that individual tree is assumed to occupy 20 meters squared, whereas a line of trees is supposed to occupy 5 meters squared. Well, you take the length of the line and multiply it by 5. Okay, so I won't go into detail there, but there are issues. So the maximum width of a hedgerow is allowed is 30 meters, minimum maximum width of tree line is also 30 meters. But we've got this 0.1 hectare threshold, which is surprising. So in many other countries, you have very detailed, they're called land parcel identification systems to identify each parcel of land and each sub parcel of land. And in Spain, for example, those have been used to determine the percentage eligibility of the farmer for basic payment. So the farmer of this field with a lot of trees, it's been calculated that he'll get 84% of the entitlement of this farmer here with fewer trees. So different countries have employed different systems, but the sophistication of the system is quite large. And this system exists in Romania. I would encourage you to have a look at it. I don't know if it's open for public downloading of the data, but it should contain the information about lines of trees, groups of trees, individual trees. So I would be very pleased if anyone can tell me whether this APIA system has a public portal, a public site where you can interrogate it like in other countries. So that's another question to accumulate for the discussion. Oh, I just did this before, and I just did this before, right? So this one is looking at the emissions of Romania in 1990, and you can say there were 229 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, which fortunately has gone down by 60%, so it's now 92%. But I'm showing this slide to show the importance of agriculture, which is the gray box, and LULUCF, which is mainly forestry, were not such a big proportion in 1990, but they are a bigger proportion now. So putting 24%, well, 21% of the total emissions now come from agriculture. And that trend is going to continue. The emissions from other sectors of the economy will get smaller, but it's very difficult to reduce the emissions from agriculture. So in 2050, there will still be agricultural emissions that have to be balanced against the sequestration from trees. But either way, the carbon balance is going to be very important. Okay, guys, these are the new targets just agreed. What's today's date? 9th. Okay, so in 2 days' time, the LULUCF, the land use change regulation, will become law. So on the 11th of May. And these are the new targets which every country has to face. So Romania currently has a, well, it has a target of, that has to be this one. Okay, so these were the LULUCF, this was the LULUCF sequestration in these years, 2016 to 2018. And the target now has been increased from what it was then. It's been increased by 2.4 million tons carbon dioxide equivalent to this. So Romania, as well as all these other countries, have been given an increased sequestration target, and they now have to produce a plan that says how they're going to do it. How many new forests will you plant? How big an area of agroforestry will you have? How much carbon is going to be sequestered? How can Romania possibly reach this new target in 2030, which is quite demanding? Okay. So every country is still facing the same. So what this slide is saying, that there's good data available for hedgerows, groups of trees, isolated trees. Romania should be using that to plan the new planting programs for its trees. And there are increasingly detailed satellite imageries available that for example, go down to very small 40 centimeters, 30 centimeter pixel resolution. Each dot on the picture is 20 centimeters. So you can see individual trees, and individual farmers get this information. They can therefore plan where on their farm, which corners, which hedges, which areas they can plant trees without too much affecting the existing production that they have, or which areas could they plant with widely spaced trees and put animals under the trees, or how many new rows of silvoarable systems could they have.
Gerry, this is based on Copernicus. These images are.
Yeah, no, this isn't. This trying to go back. So these pictures are based on, as I said, so traditionally they based it on airborne imagery, but now the satellite imagery is almost getting good enough to use that, but at the moment it isn't. So you're getting high resolution. This is not Copernicus. These are private satellites. You have to pay for this data. Copernicus is the NIST one, and we are using Copernicus. So the map that I showed you before, the red-green map with data at 100 meters, is this small woody feature one here. So that's the one that we're using. We could have used the 5-meter resolution, but it's so big it's difficult to analyze. We just chose the coarse one for that. So Copernicus is fantastic. The data becoming available from Copernicus is very impressive. This is one quick slide to talk about something called Inspire. It would be quite useful to look at the Inspire portal for Romania as well. So Inspire is a directive that has been around for a long time, since 2007, I think. And it obliges member states to provide a portal for geospatial data. Any geospatial data collected with public funds, member states are supposed to provide that on a portal. And the principle behind Inspire is that data should be collected only once and used many times. The metadata structure is standardized across Europe. Unfortunately, not all countries have been meeting those requirements. I just see quickly that Romania is probably about average. It's not as good as Austria or Germany or Italy, but it's better than France, for example. So this is quite an important data set for making the Copernicus data useful with other data sets, for example, biodiversity data sets. Okay, just moving on quickly for that because it's a bit technical. One of the campaigns that we have at the moment is to try to remind the Commission that they've promised to launch this Green Data for All initiative linked to the Inspire directive, and the Commission is not doing it. I think probably because the member states don't like the Inspire, they don't like having to make more of their data public. Okay, but those two slides are a bit technical. I'll move quickly on to reasons for planting agroforestry. And I'm structuring this around things called result indicators, which the European Union uses to measure the efficiency of the CAP. So we've got the first one, which is a result indicator adaptation to climate change. And I just showed two pictures as an example of what happens when a big storm goes through an area of conifers. So this was the storm Klaus in 2006. So these two forests are about 15 kilometers apart. You see total destruction there. You see the agroforestry system of in this case, walnut with a very much deeper root system. The trees are widely spaced, they're more wind stable, and they're not touched at all by that storm. The next indicator is reducing emissions from livestock sector, and there's quite a lot of evidence coming now that feeding leaves to livestock, particularly leaves that have a high protein content and also high tannin content, will reduce the methane emission of ruminants. So we could think about restoring the coppicing system or the pollarding system, which was typical of much of Europe a long time ago. The next priority for these indicators is carbon storage of soils and biomass. And I think, as we all know, with an agroforestry system, the tree is much bigger. Its roots spread underneath the crop. And in the case of grassland, you can add the sequestration from the grassland to the sequestration from the trees. So it's better than, well, it's not better than forests, but the total sequestration of a silvopastoral system will actually be quite similar to a forest, despite the fact there are many fewer individual trees. What else? Green energy is one of the other targets for the EU. So agriculture and forestry should produce a lot of green energy. I just put this slide in to remind everybody. So if we look at the red one, this is Europe, the whole of Europe 2018. So despite everything we hear about solar panels and wind and everything else, wood energy, fuel wood, is still producing more than half of Europe's renewable energy. And when you add the agricultural product, which is the green, and even when you add the black liquor from making paper, industrial processes, then biomass is still contributing a huge proportion of energy. So forestry and agroforestry are very important for this target. For the next target, which is energy savings in agriculture, I don't know what's happening in Romania, but everywhere in Spain, everyone is planting solar panels. and there's a lot of mixtures of crops with animals and solar panels. But you can think about the same type of system with trees. So this is from Northern Ireland. And because the sheep, so it's Northern Ireland is cold, there's a lot of wind, there's a lot of rain. The farmer is able to put the sheep outside of the animal houses earlier in spring, and he keeps them outside later in autumn. So he gets a total of 17 weeks more with the animals on the field rather than having to be protected inside. So that's a saving. That's a saving in energy in agriculture. The other thing is the improvement of soils. Huge amount of evidence about agroforestry reducing soil carbon loss through its reduction in wind and water erosion. Another EU target is the share of agricultural land under commitments to reduce ammonia emission. And we would very much say that trees are fantastic at absorbing on their foliage, at absorbing ammonia, in addition to taking up the nitrate that gets into the soil. And a lot of the ammonia that gets into the atmosphere, well, a lot in terms of the greenhouse gas efficiency or the greenhouse gas importance, a lot of that ammonia will change to nitrous oxide in the atmosphere, which is a greenhouse gas. So that's another advantage of agroforestry. The next one that the EU has as a target is protecting water quality. This is just an example from Wales in the UK, where this group of farmers got together and decided to plant trees at the boundaries of fields, or they took a soil map and looked at where trees would be better used, you know, the worst land, the land they were not using for intensive agriculture. They planted with trees, and there's huge benefits there in terms of the way that the trees have held the water and reduced the flood flow into the rivers, and downstream in the rivers, the floods are being significantly reduced because of this use of an agroforestry system. So the other big advantage for trees would be sustainable nutrient management. And here you have a slide suggesting all the potential benefits of mixing trees, generally associated with the fact that the roots are permeating the soil and improving the structure of the soil, but also absorbing nitrate. We're almost finished, but water is an interesting one too. I guess in Romania you must be suffering increasing flooding instances. So this is looking at designs where you can plant rows of trees in order to direct floodwater away from the river into floodplains. So instead of planting expensive concrete barriers, you can use rows of trees to do this. And this is one example from France where the floodwater has gone down and it's just left all the branches trapped between the trees. So it's a very cheap way of making flood control barriers. This is another example from Belgium, an area which is prone to flooding, but you can plant the trees on the swales, the ridges, and then these flooded areas you could use for other purposes. So engineering works is very possible. And I think the last one is just looking at the environmental climate performance through investment. This is looking at some research where you are using integrated pest management. So you're using the natural controls of pests of cereals, and those control insects live within your rows of trees. And the last slide in this section is talking about environmental performance through knowledge. And there's a lot of good tools potentially being developed by the European Union to provide a farmer, basing on the LPIS system that you showed before, basing on those very detailed photographs, that a farmer can input his data, get satellite imagery, including relating to trees, and optimize the use of his land. Okay, not too much detail on that. So I've got 4 slides of conclusions. The first one is that we need to plant more trees. So we need targets for tree planting, but those targets should not be planting conventional forestry in the normal way. So these targets that we have in the EU of 3 billion trees by 2030, which you can get a figure. And incidentally, it's not moving very fast in the UK, in the European Union. So the target was for 3 billion additional trees to be planted by 2030. This started in 2021. And we should have been planting 300 million trees a year. We've actually planted 10 million trees in 3 years. So it's very difficult. As you guys will know, you have a target for planting trees, but it's very hard to actually achieve it. But what I'm saying with this slide is that target should look at trees on forest land, but also trees in agricultural land. So that's the first option. The second priority is the slide that I showed before, that you need to quantify trees outside the forest and use maps like this to focus the trees where they're needed. The next slide is showing that you need to understand the failures for the previous programs. So if we're looking at the program, the Common Agricultural Policy program that just finished, it had a target to plant 600,000 hectares of afforestation by the end of the program, so by 2024 probably. But so far they've only managed to plant 40,000 hectares. Yeah, so 40,000 hectares from 600,000 hectares. For the agroforestry section, the target was planting 74,000 hectares, and they had only achieved 4,000 hectares. So for some reason, these member states, the ones in green, who were the ones that had agroforestry programs, the member states and regions were not very effective in implementing those programs and those targets. For a variety of reasons, which we can discuss, but often the deal wasn't good enough, or the farmers were worried about losing their entitlement to basic payments. Okay, that's number 3. Number 3 is using all this new technology that I've talked about before to quantify the benefit that a farmer is making to the environment by planting trees, and then come up with a scheme to measure that benefit and pay the farmer according to the degree of the benefit. So payment by results schemes in agro-environment schemes are becoming very popular. And the last slide is this one, that we really need to be aiming for a diverse landscape with areas of woodland which are joined by green veins, joined by agroforestry systems, by riparian planting, by planting along the edges of streams and roads. So agroforestry is very diverse. It can take a lot of forms. And in the Romanian context, maybe it's a way of refreshing the type of landscape with the very old oaks in Transylvania that we know of from Romania, maybe planting more of that and restoring it. I'm sure you guys are probably engaged in programs to improve these types of old landscapes, but clearly we need more of it, and not just in Romania, we need it throughout Europe. So I hope that was useful. That's 40 minutes or so.